Will history repeat itself? Here's why we hope so next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Carter. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it. Get it. Touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, and welcome to this week's edition of Michigan Podcast. One more week of talking season, and then it's game week against the Fighting Irish in South Bend a week from now. I'm Steve Deace. Coming up on this week's episode, I'm going to tell you what my baseline expectation for 2018 is and why. Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor will join us. We're going to look at one of our rivals' alternative uniforms because they look vaguely familiar. I recall seeing them on one of my favorite television shows. We're going to talk about that and more coming up later on this week here on Michigan Podcast. But we begin with the tease. I started with a question. Will history repeat itself? And then I sort of answered it when I said, boy, we hope so. Well, Michigan starts out at number 14 in the AP preseason top 25, exactly where they were in 1997, the last national championship the school won 21 years ago. And there's a lot of talk about this gauntlet of a schedule that Michigan is facing 5 teams in the AP top 12. Has Michigan ever faced anything like this? I don't know. Have they? Let's go back through the Wayback Machine and look. Here are the preseason AP rankings of Michigan's 2006 opponents when the Wolverines were coming off a 7-5 season. They had number 2 Notre Dame on the road, 16th ranked Iowa at home, number 19 Penn State on the road, number 1 Ohio State on the road. So they had 3 road games that year coming off a 7-5 season against top 19 teams, but 2 of them were against the preseason number 1 and number 2 teams, right? That team was number 2 in the country for much of the season. Here's the preseason AP ranking of Michigan's 1997 schedule coming off of 4 straight 4-loss seasons. And a Michigan grad who wrote the cover story for the Sporting News College football preview that year said the M stands for mediocrity. Michigan was done. It was toast. And then they looked at the schedule, and why wouldn't they think we're done? We opened up against 8th-ranked Colorado. Our other non-conference biggie was 11th-ranked Notre Dame. We had number 21 Iowa. On the road, we faced 25th-ranked Michigan State, number 1 Penn State, 24th-ranked Wisconsin. We closed with number 9 Ohio State. Boy, that's a strong Big Ten conference, by the way. But that schedule, people looked at that and said, no way Michigan is going to avoid another 4-loss season against that schedule. And then one of my all-time favorite teams, like that 97 team, Jim Harbaugh's junior year, Michigan coming off a 6-6 season, by far the worst year under Bo Schembechler. Here was the non-conference schedule that year and their preseason AP rankings. The non-conference schedule was 14th ranked Notre Dame on the road at number 17 South Carolina and number 7 Maryland. That was an 11-game schedule back then. Those were Michigan's 3 non-conference games. In conference, Michigan faced number 4 Iowa on the road, number 11 Illinois on the road, 8th-ranked Ohio State at home. And so much like the schedule Michigan's facing this year with 5 top 12 teams, that team faced 4 top 11 teams in the AP rankings. So can history repeat itself? Can the 2018 Wolverines come back from a 5-loss season, come back from overrated mediocrity claims from the detractors, and slay a leviathan of a schedule? Well, is there a common theme? Those other 3 teams that we just mentioned historically, do they have any common themes with this year's team? Well, there's a couple. One is the idea that Michigan's being sort of left for dead as a program, that it's been passed by. And that's been a powerful motivational tool for Michigan teams in the past. Here's another. That 1985 team had an incredible defense led by Mark Messner and Mike Hammerstein. You look at the 1997 team and the amount of guys off of that front 7, Josh Williams, James Hall, Sam Sword, guys that went on in the front 7 on the defensive side of the football. We're not even talking about a transformational player like Charles Woodson, but that defensive front 7, so many of those guys in the next few years would go on to have careers in the National Football League. And that 2006 defense, Alan Branch, Sean Crable, David Harris, Lamar Woodley, these are guys that had highly successful Super Bowl careers in the NFL. What's the strength of this year's team? You guessed it. The defensive front 7. So there are some common themes. Yes, I don't think we should stick our head in the sand about how difficult this schedule is. But you know what? To be the best, you got to beat the best. As the great prophet Ric Flair, himself a Michigan fan who almost signed to play football at Michigan, is famous for saying, to be the man, you got to beat the man. Some of these teams are this good because they've been getting good at our expense. It's time to turn the tide. Well, we get asked all the time here on Michigan Podcast by folks, hey, what can we do to help spread the word and support you guys more? Well, one of the big things you can do is support us on Patreon. Help us to cover the cost it takes to put this together each and every week here on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, etc. And as you can see, if you're watching us on YouTube here, we produce, even during the off-season, content exclusively for our Patreon supporters that we don't make available across our various platforms. For example, the more in-depth look at how Michigan's talent stacks up with its rivals that we just kind of touched on in the intro, you can see there, we released that with more analysis on our Patreon page for our Patreon supporters back on August the 4th, right? So we've also introduced a brand new tier, an exclusive booster club, $25 a month, and you get a chance to get all this kind of access to Michigan Podcast, as well as a shout out on the show, your name, business, if you'd like, in the credits. That's just $25 if you commit to that, to supporting us on Patreon, above the normal $5 pledge that several of you have already been very gracious to offer. So thank you for all the support you offer here on Michigan Podcast. Michigan Podcast at patreon.com. So for the first time since he's been the head coach at Michigan, and really for the first time since he's been a coach anywhere, since he had Andrew Luck, Jim Harbaugh announced Shea Patterson as the starting quarterback for the opener against Notre Dame. Now, if you look at Shea's career statistics entering into this season, he's played close to a full season of college football. And I would take his career stats for this season's stats right now. 3,100 yards, 23 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. Those are his career stats. I would take that sight unseen for 2018 right now if offered. And to put those numbers in perspective, here are the only quarterbacks in Michigan history with 23 or more touchdown passes in a single season. Elvis Gerbach, John Navarre, and Chad Henne, all of whom won Big Ten titles in their careers and played in the National Football League. So let's talk about Harbaugh taking this step with Shea Patterson. And would we take those numbers? Does he agree? Let's take those numbers right now if we could get them with Michael Spath, our good friend from WTKA in Ann Arbor. Good to have you back with us, Michael, here on Michigan Podcast. So let's start with Harbaugh's decision to name a starter. Were you surprised he went down this road on Monday?
It did surprise me because Jim Harbaugh has really been kind of cloak and dagger for most of his career. Not necessarily in a way that is, purposely hiding things from the media. Although I would bet that most media members would disagree with that. Just because he's never fully felt like he needed to give anything more than what was absolutely required of him, and announcing a starting quarterback is not something that was absolutely required of him. And so I am a little surprised that he did it. I think what it says to me is that not that he's, I kind of said this on our show, not that he's this great big ape that is, beating his chest and saying, hey, look at everybody, this is our guy. But I think it is a certain level of confidence that he has in this team, in this offense, especially in Shea Patterson, that it's like, hey, we don't need to go into the game with our opponent not knowing who the starter is, because we don't need every single advantage. We're going to play Michigan football the way that we were, intended to do so when I came here 4 years ago. We're going to be the better football team. We're going to have the better offense, the better defensive line, the better quarterback, and we're going to win just by lining up and outplaying you. And I think that really speaks volumes to what he's feeling about this team. It also speaks volumes to what the expectations are for this team this year. So I'm really excited by this announcement. Certainly gives everybody a chance to rally behind Shea Patterson. It also gives every single one of us an opportunity to make sure we know Brandon Peters' name. So as soon as Shea Patterson falters a little bit, we can all clamor for the backup quarterback. As I joke a little bit about that, but no, this is great news for Michigan football fans here today.
Well, you mentioned Brandon Peters. In this age, we are in an era where if I'm not starting, I'm departing, right? So that goes on all over the country. He's got 2 seasons of eligibility, Michael. Do you think Brandon Peters will stick it out here?
Boy, that's a good question. I think it comes down to whether or not he's the starting quarterback next year, honestly. He has a little bit of time left. I mean, if he gets to the spring and it looks like it's going to be Dylan McCaffrey or it looks like it's going to be Joe Milton, I think that's when Brandon Peters will have to make a hard decision. But I don't think that time. I don't think that time is now. I think he'll see how this season goes. Certainly, too, if he thinks that Shea Patterson is going to be a one and done, which is a possibility, he can look at the situation and say, okay, I'm going to stick around. This will be my job after that. But no, I think it really depends on how the battle goes in the spring. If in fact Shea is the starter all year long and Brandon is relegated to a backup role.
I mentioned a few minutes ago Shea Patterson's career numbers so far in college football. He's basically at Ole Miss. He basically played what amounts to a full season. And his career numbers are 3,100 yards, 23 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions. I would take that right now for 2018. You agree or disagree?
Well, considering last year, I think they threw for like 27,000 interceptions, and they had like 4 touchdown passes, and they didn't throw for 1,000 yards. No, I would take those. I would take those numbers. I got to say, I mean, and this is probably a little bit, unrealistic as where we are as fans right now, but I actually have higher expectations than those numbers that you mentioned. Now, what I like about those numbers is it's a positive touchdown interception ratio, but and it's almost 2-to-1, which is a good number. But I honestly think that this offense, we've been waiting as fans for this offense to really truly explode to the level of what we've seen across college football, and with what they have at the skill positions. And then what they have at tight end with Zach Gentry and Sean McEwen, I really think that the ceiling on this offense is closer to the 3,500 yards and closer to 30 touchdowns. I think this could be a record-breaking season, just because that's the way that college football has trended. I mean, you know, to put those numbers out there and someone say like, well, my God, the record's 25 at Michigan. Yeah, but there's 40 quarterbacks in college football that are throwing for 30 touchdowns a year right now. So I really think that when we're looking at it, those are the type of numbers that I expect someone like Shea Patterson with the weapons at his disposal and in a Jim Harbaugh offense to put up.
There is something coming out of camp I'm concerned about, and it's nothing personal against the player. It's all the hype about Grant Perry. Here's why I am concerned. And I'm not concerned that a senior receiver who has shown at times he runs great routes, has great hands, is outperforming still largely untested sophomores like Nico Collins and Tariq Black. That's not my concern. My concern is, and you and I have talked about this before, we're still at the stage where everything bad or good that is mentioned with your team is at the expense of someone else on your team, right? Because that's all they're facing. Mm-hmm. And we know the number one weakness on this defense last year, maybe its only weakness, was what? Inability to cover receivers in the slot. They bring in Casey Hughes, Ambry Thomas. We've talked about, he's been talked about as taking a huge step. Brad Hawkins is a guy that's supposed to add more of a coverage strength at the safety spot compared to what we saw from Josh Metellus last year. So tell me I should not be concerned that Grant Perry in the slot as a slot receiver is eating up our defense, according to a lot of camp reports. Tell me I shouldn't be concerned about that.
I'm not going to tell you that you can't be concerned about it. I will say this, that I think a lot of things that they do in fall camp is situational. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, you know, they certainly do some ones versus ones in scrimmage situations. But I think a lot of it too is a matter of, well, they're running certain patterns that work for Grant Perry right now. You know, you're not unleashing your entire blitz scheme. You're not unleashing everything that Don Brown wants to do defensively. So I'm not as worried about that. I certainly think that covering slot receivers, as you mentioned, is something that we're, as Michigan fans, we're a little bit like, okay, how is this going to be any better? Is Josh Metellus, is Brad Hawkins, who's been generating a lot of positive buzz at the safety position. Jalen Kelly-Powell has been generating some positive thoughts at the safety position. Can one of those guys really, you know, lock up that slot receiver, or is it going to be Tyreek Kinnell again in that position, which was not a good look for Michigan last year? You know, it's hard for me to say, and I understand where you're coming from, like where every time that there's a positive, there has to be a negative when you're playing yourself. Mm-hmm. And I get that, but I guess I'm not, because we're not privy to see those practices. And from what I can tell, it hasn't been a lot of ones versus ones in those situations. I'm not ready to you know, run the alarm bell, ring the alarm bell and run the flag up yet.
A lot of talk about where Michigan's ranked in the preseason AP poll, number 14. That's exactly where they were in 1997. Is this schedule too difficult? So I opened up the program this week talking about historically Michigan's season similar to the one they had last year and how they bounced back and the schedules they faced. So these were the preseason AP rankings of Michigan's 2006 schedule coming off a 7-5 season. At number 2 Notre Dame, 16th ranked Iowa, at number 19 Penn State, at Ohio State, who was preseason number 1. So that team faced a schedule where they were going to face the number 1 and number 2 preseason teams on the road. Then you go back to 1997. Again, Michigan, 4 straight 4-loss seasons, preseason number 14 in the AP poll. This was their preseason ranking of their opponents that year. Colorado 8th, Notre Dame 11th, Iowa 21st, Michigan State on the road, number 25. Penn State on the road, number 1. Wisconsin on the road, number 24. And then number 9, Ohio State. Boy, that's a gauntlet. And then there's 1985. This was a team that Jim was on, and he led the nation in pass efficiency. This was the schedule of Michigan's 1985 opponents that they were going to face in the preseason. Number 14, Notre Dame, at number 17, South Carolina, number 7, Maryland. That was the non-conference schedule. Then they were going to face number 4, Iowa on the road, number 11, Illinois on the road, and Ohio State, number 8. So here are 3 examples, Mike, of Michigan coming off disappointing seasons, facing schedules the next year. Everybody said they're going to get buried by those schedules. Those teams, that 1985 team finished number 2 in the country. The 1997 team finished number 1. The 2006 team was ranked number 2 in the country for about the last month of the season. Can this team do what those predecessors did coming off a disappointing campaign and largely slay a gauntlet of a schedule? What do you think?
I think they can, and I think that's really interesting that all three of those teams, three of the most successful teams in the last 30 years of Michigan football, all face such horrific schedules, at least as it appeared on paper. I think you've got a couple of thoughts there. I mean, one, you're right. For all those years, they're coming off a disappointing season, just like they have been, so they're super motivated. This schedule is not something that they run from. Instead, they look at it as a challenge, something that they can conquer every single week. And to tell you the truth, the one thing that helps when you have a schedule like that is that it's easier for you to be focused every single week. When you take those weeks off and you struggle against Northwestern, or you struggle against a Purdue or a Maryland or something like that, there's going to be so many big games that they're going to be locked in, and they're going to have to be mentally locked in all season for them to be successful. And so I'm excited about it. Now, I don't know, and you read a bunch of numbers there. I don't know if Michigan's ever faced 5 teams ranked in the preseason AP top 12 to start a year, and certainly that's going to be when they play every single one of those teams. But that is a tremendous challenge. But there's no running away from it. And frankly, I looked back at this a couple years ago because people said that no national champion had beaten 5 ranked teams, and Alabama a couple years back, and Clemson a couple years back, and a lot of these teams had schedules like this where they had to beat 5 or 6 or even, I think the one year Alabama had to beat 7 ranked teams in one year to win a national championship. So the best teams find a way to make it happen, and you can't run from it, and you can't use it as an excuse. I mean, this is the way the Michigan schedule is, and you know what? The reason some of these teams are playing so well and are ranked where they are is because Michigan hasn't taken care of business the last couple of years.
Right.
If Michigan does that, then someone like Penn State, someone like Michigan State, maybe isn't the preseason top 10 team. So this is Michigan's doing a little bit, and they've got to put these teams back where not where their places, but just reassert themselves as a better program than Notre Dame, Michigan State, Penn State, Wisconsin, and let's pray to God Ohio State one of these years.
Final question, Michael. You're there on the ground in Ann Arbor. For our listeners on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, viewers here on YouTube, Michigan fans are really across the country. What are you seeing and hearing there close to the situation that we're not getting out here in the larger Michigan fan community around the country? What's the close-up view of what's happening here as we head into our first game week next week?
Well, I think everybody is kind of in the same, everybody gets excited preseason. Everybody kind of overlooks and diminishes their weaknesses. We had Devin Gardner on our show on Tuesday, and he was kind of dismissing, the offensive line, yeah, they haven't played perfect, but they're getting there. And I'm like, no, it's not that they haven't played even average. I think that what happens in the preseason, we all get caught up a little bit and probably overestimate our team a little bit. That said, there really is this quiet confidence emanating from all of the different people that we talk to on a regular basis, and so I think it's going to be a really good year. I mean, I really do. I don't. If they could go 10-2 and they could still win they could still be in the College Football Playoff potentially because of just how good the schedule is this year. But all I hear time and time again is how confident everybody feels about this unit, that this is going to be a special team this year. So I hope that they're right. It'll certainly make the season a lot more fun if we're talking about wins over Notre Dame and Michigan State and Wisconsin and Penn State and leading up to that game against Ohio State and everything to play for.
Well, as I look at, it is a gauntlet of a schedule. I also think on both sides of the ball, this is the most talented team Michigan's had since 2006. And if you go look at those 3 historic teams we just talked about, they all had something in common. They had great defensive front sevens, which this team is going to have as well. But you have to factor in the schedule. To me, here's the baseline expectation. It's a successful season if we're in a New Year's 6 bowl game. That's a successful season to me. Yeah. Your thoughts?
I would say a successful season if you're in a New Year's 6 bowl game, and if you're not in the national championship, if you're not in the college football playoff, then I better see a couple of wins over rivals regardless of that. If you're in the New Year's 6 bowl game, but you got there at 9-3 because you're in the Big Ten and you're Michigan, and you've lost to Michigan State and Ohio State, that's still not going to be good enough for me. For me, honestly, Steve, this whole season comes down to whether or not Michigan's playing in Indianapolis. If they're playing in Indianapolis, I'm going to be happy with the season because of what it meant to get there. If they're not playing in Indianapolis, then I consider this season a disappointment. And I don't say an abject failure because let's see how the season unfolds. But they need to be playing in Indianapolis.
And of course, you have to have mitigating factors. If there's a historic year of injuries, you have to acknowledge that. But short of that, I agree. The schedule isn't an excuse. It may be a reason why they don't go 11-1, but there is a talent level here that there is simply no excuse not to have a meaningful season, barring crazy freak injuries. Michael Spath, WTKA in Ann Arbor. Good to talk to you again, brother. Thanks for joining us here on Michigan Podcast.
Thank you.
All right, go Blue. Coming soon. That's all I can say right now, but stay tuned. You're going to be seeing that logo more often here, and we'll tell you what it means soon. This week's Twitter poll results, we asked you, what do you think Michigan's final regular season record will be? 37% of you said 11-1. 34% of you said 10-2, which is my official prediction. 19% of you said 9-3. 10% of you said 8-4. So, I mean, that's a pretty good cross-section of opinion, and I think it shows why there are so many questions about this year's team given the performance of last year's. Question of the week this week, I'm asking myself the question this week. Who wears it better? Right? So these are Notre Dame's new unis for their Shamrock Series. They're playing at Yankee Stadium later this year against Syracuse. And I looked at these uniforms and I thought, I've seen these before. They look like the Arkham City prison guards on one of my favorite video games. And then I thought, no, one of my favorite TV shows has a very similar look. Man in the High Castle. Tell me who wears that better. Notre Dame. What you doing? You got one of the iconic uniforms in the sport. What you doing with this? Okay? Now, that's... Irish eyes should be crying. Should be crying at that. Want to thank all of you that help us with this podcast each and every week. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast, where we keep you updated throughout the week on our thoughts. Want to thank our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast as well. And make sure you subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play if you can't watch the television show here on YouTube, and help us to spread the word. If you want to help us, subscribe, click like, share links. That helps us to get the word out. Somebody posted on our YouTube page this week, man, I really want to see your channel blow up now that football season's here. Well, you folks out there in the audience, the thousands of you that watch this every week, you can have a huge say in our channel blowing up now that the season has arrived by sharing it and telling as many Michigan fans you know about what we do each week here at Michigan Podcast. Until next week, and it's game week, go Blue.